Well, thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Teresa, for that warm introduction and for the work that the folks at KBOO do. It's so important to defend independent media and to keep community media outlets alive, and I'm honored always to be on the airwaves of KBOO, and I'm truly honored to be here at Powell's because we desperately need a response to these behemoth corporations and an independent way to distribute books so that it's not also going for nefarious activities of mega corporations. So thank you to the folks here at Powell's for everything that you do. I want to begin at the outset here by just embarrassing someone who I've actually never met, but my good friend Sophie Ragsdale, who's a colleague of mine at The Nation. I understand her dad is here, and I just wanted to wish him a happy Father's Day from his daughter in person. So happy Father's Day, Mr. Ragsdale. Wherever you are. I want to begin just by apologizing if some of the things that I talk about tonight are already known to you. I'm sure that there are many of you in this room that follow these events and incidents very closely, and some of the territory that I'm going to cover tonight you may already be aware of, so sorry in advance if some of what I tell you already knew. In the updated version of my book, I have about 130, 140 pages of completely new material, and then I went through the book and I updated some of the key facts surrounding the congressional investigation into Blackwater, as well as some of the lawsuits that have been filed against the company, but also looking at the lethal, deadly events of the past year, as well as ending the book with a new chapter called Blackwater Beyond Bush that looks at the future of these companies and what's at stake in the 2008 presidential election. But I want to begin by telling a story that I'm sure all of you heard about and followed, and it happened last year on the afternoon of September 16th, 2007, in Baghdad, in an area called the Mansour district. And it was an area that I knew well. I've been there many times in my travels to Iraq, and it used to be a real upscale part of the Iraqi capital, and now it's a sort of a hollow shell of its former self. But on this particular day, a 20-year-old Iraqi medical student named Ahmed Haytham al-Rubai was driving in a car with his mother, Mahasin, the family's white Opel sedan. His mother also was a doctor, and they had just dropped off his father, Dr. Jawad. He also was a doctor. Medicine was very much in this family's DNA, and in fact, they had made a conscious decision to remain in Iraq. Like some fortunate Iraqis, they had the opportunity to leave their country when the U.S. invaded, and they decided not to do that because as a family they believed that their services as medical professionals would be needed more than ever in their country as it was preparing to absorb a barrage of violence and chaos. And so this family stayed, and on this particular day when Ahmed was driving his mother, Mahasin, they were running errands. Among the errands they were running was dropping off college applications for Ahmed's younger sister, and they pulled into the Mansour neighborhood, and at the time they were approaching a major intersection. A convoy of armored vehicles was careening down the wrong side of a one-way road, and Iraqi police officers in the square that day, which was Nisr Square, scrambled to cut off traffic. This is common in Iraq. When the most important people in Iraq come careening down the road, the Iraqi police have to stop traffic. And of course, the most important people in Iraq are not Iraqis, they are U.S. VIPs. And so on this day when these armored vehicles were coming into the square and Ahmed and his mother were pulling into the square, the men inside of the armored vehicles decided that they viewed Ahmed Haytham al-Rubai and his mother Mahasin as potential terrorists or car bombers, and they decided to shoot Ahmed Haytham al-Rubai in his head. And after they shot him, his mother began shrieking. And we know this from the testimony, and I write about this in the book of eyewitnesses that day. She started shrieking and grabbing onto her son and hollering, help me, my son, my son. And two Iraqi police officers responded, and they described how they tried to pull her out of the vehicle, and that her grip was so tight on her son's body that they couldn't get her out. And they saw that the men in the armored vehicles were once again training their weapons on the car, and they were concerned that more shots were going to come, and the Iraqi police officers held up their hands to show that they themselves were not armed, but also to try to make clear that what they were doing was trying to get this woman out of the car. And then it became apparent to the Iraqi police officers that more shots, gunfire rained down on that vehicle, and witnesses say that the car exploded and burst into flames. burning Mahassan and her son Ahmed inside of the vehicle. That kicked off 15 minutes of very heavy gunfire at Nicer Square that day, and it lasted about, as I say, a quarter of an hour. At the end of it, 17 Iraqi civilians were dead. Among the other victims was a 9-year-old boy named Ali who was shot in his head, and his father described having his hand over his son's heart and still feeling it beating and running to a hospital trying to save his son's life, and then arriving there and the doctors telling him that there was nothing that they could do, that his son was dead. And this man's name was Mohammed. He returned the next day to gather pieces of his son's skull that he could find in the square, because he wanted to try to bury as much of the body as he could find in the Iraqi holy city of Najaf. Children were killed that day, women were killed that day. In fact, several people who survived, and also some who were killed, were shot in the back as they tried to flee the scene. And the individuals who did the shooting that day from those armored vehicles were not members of the United States military on active duty. They weren't members of Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army or al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. They were private forces working for Blackwater. And what happened after this played out in the international media. The Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki was under the mistaken impression that he actually was in charge of the country, and the Iraqi government ordered Blackwater as a company to leave Iraq. And the Iraqi judicial system indicated that it intended to prosecute the shooters as they would any criminal who had committed this kind of an act in the country. Of course, things are not so simple. Nouri al-Maliki is not the Prime Minister of Iraq. Condoleezza Rice apparently is. And Jalal Talabani is not the president. George Bush apparently is. And so the Bush administration got on the phone, ostensibly to offer an apology, but more importantly to read the riot act to its puppet regime in Baghdad. And for 3 days, Blackwater's work was in fact shut down while this crisis played out, this what was described as a diplomatic crisis between Baghdad and Washington. And on the 4th day, Blackwater's operatives were armed and back on the streets of Iraq again, and it became perhaps the most potent symbol of the utter lack of sovereignty in Iraq, that Blackwater's men were back on the streets. In fact, we learned just how deeply embedded and how central to the U.S. occupation Blackwater is when those 3 days went down that Blackwater wasn't working. No U.S. officials could go anywhere. No non-military officials could go anywhere. An Iraqi friend of mine said they turned the green zone into the green zoo because they were all essentially trapped in there with the Cinnabons and the espressos and Burger King. But what's important to understand here is how the White House responded to this. Now, Blackwater works on a U.S. State Department contract. A lot of people believe that Blackwater works for the military. Blackwater does not work for the military. Blackwater works directly for the White House. Which means that it's outside of the military command structure, and it also means that, in the words of Congressman Dennis Kucinich, it is effectively an armed wing of the administration operating in Iraq. And so Blackwater guards the State Department in Iraq, and the individuals tasked with investigating, quote-unquote, Blackwater right away after this were in fact State Department personnel who depended on Blackwater to keep them alive while they were investigating Blackwater. Now, if you or I were accused of killing anyone or crimes of a much less serious nature, if we're lucky in this country, we would be read something called the Miranda rights. We'd be told we had the right to remain silent, that anything we say can and will be used against us in a court of law. When State Department investigators interviewed the individuals at the center of this shooting, they gave them something called limited use immunity. And what this effectively said was that nothing you say to us in this investigation can and will be used against you in a court of law, and none of the information gleaned from the interview with you can be used to bring criminal charges against you, sort of like a reverse Miranda right. Just to put this in a historical context, that's how Oliver North got off. He was given limited use immunity to testify in front of the United States Congress about Iran-Contra, and then his lawyers later effectively argued that there would not have been a prosecution of him would not have been possible had the prosecutors not used evidence that was gained from his protected testimony in front of the Congress. So that was the first thing that the Bush administration did, was to immunize the suspects in the worst massacre of Iraqi civilians committed by a U.S.-funded private force in Iraq, to immunize them from any form of effective prosecution. Now, the Blackwater version of events around this time emerged. Blackwater said we were victims of an armed ambush by insurgents and enemies, and they said that our men were nobly defending American lives in a hostile war zone. They have a sort of ready-made press release that almost always says the same thing when things go lethally wrong in Iraq. And so Blackwater's version was out there. The Iraqi government did its investigation and said that there was no one shooting at the Blackwater men. This was an unprovoked attack, and you had those two stories kind of playing out. Then Blackwater and its allies alleged that perhaps members of the Iraqi police or military had engaged in an attack on Blackwater in addition to the armed insurgents and enemies, etc. And so we were off to the races. Now, Blackwater's allies in the media started spinning a story, and Blackwater's owner picked up on this, that you can't trust anything that the Iraqi government says because the investigation was done by the Interior Ministry, which is a hotbed of sectarianism under the direct control of Muqtada al-Sadr, and you can't believe anything that comes out of the mouths of the Iraqis, despite the fact that U.S. liaisons work at the Interior Ministry. The Bush administration promotes this as a sovereign government. Blackwater and its friends were saying, you can't believe anything the Iraqis are saying. And then one day, we get word that something called the First Blush Report of the State Department was being leaked. And when we read it in the media, it was a piece of paper that had the official seal of the United States State Department on it, and it defended Blackwater's versions of events right down to the letter. Now, and it was presented as the State Department's first blush analysis of what had happened there. The interesting thing about this document is that it was in fact written by a Blackwater contractor named Darren Hanner and was placed on State Department stationery and presented in the media as the State Department's version of events. Now, the top law enforcement agency in the United States is the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI was not dispatched by the Bush administration for 2 full weeks after the killings took place. It's criminology 101. You seal off a crime scene, you gather the evidence, you interview witnesses, you try to piece together a timeline of what happened. For 2 weeks, the Bush administration stalled on sending the FBI over there and left the investigation in the hands of the State Department, who was depending on Blackwater to keep it alive while investigating Blackwater. And when the FBI was preparing to go over there, we learned that they were going to be guarded by Blackwater when they went over to investigate Blackwater. And only after Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont raised a ruckus about this did the FBI say, okay, we'll provide our own protection for our agents when they go to investigate Blackwater and not use Blackwater for protection when we investigate Blackwater. But while all of this stuff was going on, something happened that got almost no attention whatsoever. And that was that there was a third force here, not the State Department, not the Iraqi government, and not Blackwater's versions of events, but a third force that responded to that shooting and arrived there about 20 minutes after the last shots were fired. And this force could not be so easily dismissed by Blackwater and its allies as a hotbed of sectarianism because it was in fact the United States military. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Tarsa and his men responded to this shooting. They arrived on the scene. They did a crime scene investigation. They examined shell casings and determined that there was no involvement of Iraqi police or military, and that the shooting, they labeled the shooting a criminal event. Those are the exact words of Lieutenant Colonel Mike Tarsa, that it was unprovoked and that it was in fact a criminal event. And his men said it had every indication of an excessive shooting, and they also said that they were shocked at the caliber of weapon being used by the Blackwater men in the square that day, saying that they were inconsistent with weapons the U.S. military would use when going into a crowded neighborhood. And yet that story went nowhere. No one picked up on it. It still is never talked about when this reporting happens. When the FBI finally did go over to Iraq to investigate, the initial findings were leaked by federal agents who said that their calculation was that 14 of the 17 Iraqis killed that day were killed as a result of unjustified and unprovoked gunfire. Now, mind you, this is the top law enforcement agency of the most tainted and corrupted Justice Department in the history of this country, and they went over and said 14 of the 17 Iraqis killed by forces in the employ of a politically connected company were killed as a result of unjustified and unprovoked gunfire. A military official, U.S. military official, responded to that by saying that the FBI is being too generous to Blackwater and reiterating its belief that all of the deaths that occurred there were unjustifiable and unprovoked. And then what happened is that Eric Prince, the owner of Blackwater, is called by Henry Waxman, who's the chair of the top investigative body of the Congress, the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. Waxman had been investigating Blackwater for about 3 years leading up to this on all sorts of issues, and had really been aggressive. And the last time he had asked Erik Prince to testify was in February of 2007, and I was there, and instead of coming in person, Erik Prince sent his lawyer to the committee instead of appearing himself. But he had to show up on this day. And so for the first time, this infamous mercenary force in Iraq had a very public face. And so Erik Prince, the Tom Cruise Navy SEAL with the shaved head with the little Superman twirl in the front, comes in wearing his sharp blue suit, much more CEO or businessman than mercenary or Navy SEAL, and he comes in not surrounded by an army of Blackwater bodyguards, but by an army of advisors and PR people and lawyers, and he walks in and he's surrounded by a mob of paparazzi. And I had gone down, and he said that his first thought when he walked into the room that day was, "My God, my days as a covert operator are over." That was on his mind that day. So I had gone down to D.C. for this, and the night before this hearing, I managed to get a copy of Erik Prince's prepared testimony. He clearly believed that what was going to happen that day, according to this testimony, was that he was going to be asked aggressive questions about what happened at Nisour Square. He had his version of events, enemies of an armed ambush, all of these things ready to go, and was going to try to say, but it would be inappropriate for me to discuss this matter further while it's under investigation. The next morning, we learned that the White House had announced or informed Henry Waxman's committee that it was going to be conducting a criminal investigation into this, and Henry Waxman should not take any testimony on Nisour Square from Erik Prince or any other witnesses because it could contaminate the investigation. Now, we have a system of checks and balances in theory in this country. Henry Waxman has an independent right, as the Congress does, to conduct its own investigations. It represents a full 1/3 of the United States government. They have an independent right. So I thought, because I have a tremendous amount of respect for Henry Waxman, that he actually was going to show serious spine that day and tell the Bush Justice Department to back off. When we got there and Erik Prince came in and sits down, the first thing that Waxman says is that he's been asked by the Justice Department not to take any testimony on Nisour Square, and while he wanted to assert that the Congress has an independent right to conduct these kinds of investigations, he was going to respect the will of the White House in this case. And so Erik Prince, the man whose forces were at the center of this incredibly violent action that the U.S. military labeled a criminal event, was not asked any questions about Nisour Square that day. And in fact, he sort of won the day on October 2nd, 2007 when he testified, and it was primarily the responsibility of the Democrats on that committee. They were doing their homework while the test was taking place. Henry Waxman's staff had done a very far-reaching investigative report days before this hearing that it distributed to all members of the committee. The job of the members of that committee, as the sort of guardians of U.S. democratic process, is how they think of themselves, was to read that report and come prepared, not just to ask Erik Prince questions, but to follow up if he said something that just didn't pass muster. And so while Erik Prince was testifying, many of the Democrats on the committee were actually reading the report for the first time as they sat there listening to Erik Prince. And with only a handful of few and far between exceptions, the Democrats really didn't do much by way of getting into any of the relevant issues. The first 2 hours of the hearing were spent on something that happened 4 years ago involving Blackwater, and it was just the gorilla in the room, no talk of Nisour Square. When Representative Danny Davis of Illinois said to Erik Prince, "Mr. Prince, are you saying that your forces have never killed innocent civilians in Iraq?" Erik Prince said, "Yes, sir. Well, maybe some have died as a result of traffic accidents or ricochet bullets." Traffic accidents or ricochet bullets. How about the 17 people that just died in Nisour Square? Was that one big traffic accident? Were they all jaywalking and a Blackwater convoy ran into them? And it goes nowhere. And so Prince spins his company in front of the Congress as, it reminded me of Jack Nicholson in that movie A Few Good Men, where he's with Tom Cruise and he talks about eating his Cheerios, 600 meters from Cubans who want to kill me. Erik Prince like Batman coming out of the cave and sort of saving the day for all the good guys. And he used terms like the bad guys and our men bleed red, white, and blue. And in fact, Blackwater has a poster, a promotional poster that they sell in their pro shop. You can also get infant onesies with the Blackwater logo, or Blackheart, the Blackwater teddy bear. But they have a poster that has Blackwater men on a roof, and it's a dark and stormy night, and they're projecting a light, and instead of the bat symbol on it, it's the Blackwater logo, and they actually sell this. They sell this poster. So he's Batman, and coming to meet the people of Gotham in front of for the first time, and that was it. And he sort of grabbed the name tag off the table and put it in his pocket and left the room and sort of declared victory over Henry Waxman and his committee. And of course, the Bush administration threw a major Hail Mary pass to Blackwater, and unfortunately, Henry Waxman completed the pass for him by just saying, okay, well, we won't ask this guy any questions about that. Prince isn't going to come back in front of the Congress again. But he did go on a blitzkrieg, a media blitzkrieg, and he was basically on everything. He was on Charlie Rose, on 60 Minutes, The Today Show, Wolf Blitzer, blah, 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 articles in Newsweek, Washington Post. And it was, for the most part, this sort of glowing coverage of this guy. People spent more time talking about his haircut and his boyish good looks, which whatever, that's part of the story. But more on his physical appearance than on like what actually brought him there in the first place. And it was one of the most shameful moments in recent, and there's a lot of shameful moments in recent media history in this country, but it truly was a sort of moment, I think, of great shame. And my sort of involvement in this was that on September 16th, when this shooting happened, I was at a friend's birthday party, and it sort of went late into the night, and I remember thinking that day, well, I'm going to start looking at other stories now and working on something else. And the next morning, I kind of woke up groggy, and I look at my phone, and I had like 23 missed calls, and I have a BlackBerry, and that little sand in the hourglass thing was spinning around because there's so many messages coming in, and it was people telling me about the Nicer Square thing, but also my friends from Democracy Now! Said, CNN has called about 15 times this morning. They want you to be on right away. I'm like, it's just some kind of a joke. And so from my thought, from my perspective on this was that somebody at CNN Googled Blackwater, and they saw that someone wrote a book about it. They didn't bother to look into who I am, that I'm the riffraff or something. And next thing I know, I'm sitting in a CNN studio on a simultaneously broadcast CNN International domestic program at noon called Your World Today. And I don't remember the exact phrasing of any of this. This is a paraphrasing of the whole thing. But I sit down, and the interviewer clearly wanted to sort of talk about the nuts and bolts of Blackwater. So, well, tell us about this company that's made up of former veterans and special forces guys. And so we did a little bit of that. And then we started to get into some of the accountability issues and the out of control nature of the cowboys over there. And the interviewer says to me, well, it sounds like you're very critical of these companies. It's like, if you even had read one sentence of the book, it would have been a little bit clear to you. And he said, so what is your alternative? Now, I don't remember who said it, but you should answer the question that you should have been asked. So I know what he meant. He meant I should have said something like, well, the United States military should be doing this, or it should be State Department diplomatic security. But I decided to answer the question of what is the alternative to the occupation of Iraq. And I said, well, I believe that the United States should withdraw all of its military forces from Iraq and its contractors and mercenaries from Iraq. And I thought for certain, that was it. That was the end of the interview, and I was going to, go back to being on Democracy Now! and never getting these kinds of calls again. And there was, I don't know if it was that he didn't quite know what to do with it, or he sort of agreed. I didn't quite understand, but there was this pause, and so I decided to keep going. And I said, and I believe that the United States should pay reparations to the Iraqi people for the destruction that's been wrought on their country. And then he definitely was stunned this time, but he paused again. And so I said, all right, well, I'm just gonna keep going. And I said, and I have to say that it really is the arrogance of the United States to believe that we're going to step into a society that has been in existence for thousands of years and tell these people how to run their country. And with that, the interview definitely was brought to a swift halt. But there were about 6 weeks where I actually was invited on these shows, and I debated industry representatives. The Mercenary industry has a trade association that's called it is pretty funny, huh? But if you're laughing at that, you're gonna have to probably leave the room after this next one. The name of it is the International Peace Operations Association. Yeah, ay caramba. And the logo of the International Peace Operations Association is a cartoon sleeping lion that looks like, the Lion King. Like you get the popcorn, kids. We're going to go visit the International Peace Operations Association lion. And so I would debate this poor man from this association who became the face of these guys. And, he's sort of a professorial type. And he became the face of the mercenary industry. And I was on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, and I was debating him on Democracy Now! And all these things. And then one day they just stopped letting him come on anymore. They just sort of said, Doug, the turnip is dry on this thing, buddy. And so I, because I have no experience hanging out with the powerful media people, I don't go and have, drinks with these people, I don't hang out with, powerful Congress people, I was sort of naive for a moment and thought, well, if someone like me, who is militantly opposed to the war, ends up on this, and I took it very seriously because people like us are, and I assume many of us in the room, are almost never allowed at that table to say anything. Despite the fact that we represent a significant portion of this population, we are completely whited out from that scene and not allowed to be on. And so for the first time, really since this invasion and occupation began, someone who actually was militantly opposed to the war was on these programs. And I took that responsibility very seriously and talked with a lot of people in the broader social justice community about strategy on this, and it lasted for about 6 weeks, and I was invited to testify in front of the Senate, and I in my naivete, really believed that their days in Iraq were numbered. It did seem like the momentum was heading in that direction, and then one day it all just sort of stopped, and the Democrats went back to being Democrats, and the corporate media went back to being the corporate media, and Blackwater sort of went away, and Eric Prince drove. Blackwater continued its work in Iraq, and I knew Blackwater's contract was up for renewal in April or May, and I kept searching the federal contractor database, seeing if the contract was going to be renewed, and was talking to people within the industry. And then in the first week of April, the Bush administration quietly announced that it was in fact renewing Blackwater's contract for yet another year in Iraq. And so now, like much of U.S. policy, what happens with Blackwater in Iraq is going to be left for the next president to decide. And I'm going to talk in a moment about the positions of both Barack Obama and John McCain on this issue, because I think some of what I'm going to say, especially if you're an Obama supporter, may jolt you a bit, because it's not what conventional wisdom would necessarily dictate in the big stadiums that make up his events. But let's be clear on one thing here. The Republicans could run a head of lettuce for president, and the head of lettuce would be the candidate of Blackwater and all of these other war companies. They would be talking about how head of lettuce is going to protect us, head of lettuce is a patriot, head of lettuce is honorably serving the country, and at the same time greening America. And so, but we have a candidate slightly more enthusiastic than the head of lettuce on the Republican side, and then we have Barack Obama, and for the first time in 15 years, the war industry has been giving more of the Batmobile back into the cave, and we didn't see the bat signal again, and money in political campaign donations to the Democrats than to the Republicans, and that's because it's a wise business investment. The war business has always been bipartisan. Anyone who has any illusions about the Democrats being an anti-war party just needs to look at the 8 years of the Clinton administration, with some of the most belligerent policies in recent U.S. history, not just on Iraq, but in the Balkans, Latin America, Central America, Haiti, elsewhere. So the Democrats have long been on board with the war agenda, and the way the system kind of works is that every once in a while the Democrats have to come in to kind of clean up the image of the United States while still using the iron fist of U.S. militarism, so that the Republicans can then come and overtly try to destroy the world, and it's just kind of back and forth. Well, John McCain in 2000 probably would have had a different view on this. Right now, though, the PR guru who is sitting on his bus, Charlie Black, as his top strategist, was the man that Blackwater hired to prepare Eric Prince for his congressional testimony. And Charlie Black runs a political consulting company that was under the umbrella of Burstyn Marsaller, which was run by Hillary Clinton's top strategist, Mark Penn. And so both the Clinton campaigns and the McCain campaigns had direct connections to Blackwater in this current election. But Barack Obama has a very complicated position on this. Obama, probably second only to Senator Bernie Sanders in the Senate, understands this issue. In fact, Barack Obama introduced what has now become the Democrats' leading legislation to try to bring oversight, accountability, reform to the private military industry. And he introduced it 8 months before Nisour Square. So he definitely was on this. And, I know people that have worked with Obama on this, that work for him on his campaign and in his Senate staff. And it's not just that he has staffers that understand it. Obama actually really has rolled his sleeves up on this and gets it. The legislation, though, that he is promoting in the Senate, it already passed the House, has been endorsed by Blackwater. Blackwater's owner, Eric Prince, when he was told that it passed the House, he said that's excellent. And the reason is this, and I've been very critical of this legislation, although I think there are some good concepts at play here. Obama's legislation looks very good on paper. There's all sorts of rules and regulations, and so you can look at it and say, oh, that makes sense. You're going to have the FBI go over and investigate, and then arrests will be made, and people will be prosecuted in U.S. courts if they commit crimes abroad. I mean, it all seems sort of logical until you step back from it and apply a bit of common sense. How on earth are they going to do this? Right now in Iraq, there are 180,000 private contractors operating alongside 150,000 U.S. troops. The military, with its massive bureaucracy, has been totally inadequate in its response to crimes being committed by U.S. soldiers. And so the idea that you're going to somehow have this huge mechanism in place that's going to oversee the parallel shadow army of contractors is ludicrous. I asked the sponsor in the House, David Price, representative of North Carolina, who's going to translate for the investigators? Who's going to protect the investigators? Who's going to arrest a former Navy SEAL and bring him back to the United States if he's believed to have committed a crime? And it was as though he had never thought about it. He said, well, those are good questions. Yes, they're good questions and apparently with no answers. And so the reason why Blackwater is backing this legislation is because it's a sort of propaganda victory for them. They can say we have the Obama legislation, which really is meant to keep contractors in line and punish those who engage in misconduct, while at the same time knowing it is completely unenforceable. Now, Obama's to be credited for at least doing something. Most of the Democrats, spend all of their time hanging out in the congressional, cafeteria and smokers club and all that stuff, instead of actually writing legislation or working on the most pressing issues of our time. I mean, the crowning achievement of Nancy Pelosi's time in charge of the Congress has been to get an approval rating lower than that of President Bush. And it's an incredible, incredible achievement. She had to work very, very hard to get to where she is. Less popular than President Bush. And it's because the Democrats have not taken on these issues with any kind of spine or with any kind of dedication. To me, this would have been a no-brainer issue. No one could have come back and said, oh, you're not supporting the troops. We're talking about for-profit war corporations that benefit from an escalation of bloodshed and violence in Iraq, many of whom are totally connected to not only the Republican Party establishment, but to the radical religious right. And so all that we've gotten out of the Congress is what Obama has presented, this legislation. I interviewed Barack Obama's senior foreign policy advisors about this issue, and I wanted to know, what is Obama's position going to be if he wins the presidency with regard to the war contractor industry, specifically Blackwater. And one of his senior foreign policy advisors who works on this issue said that Obama cannot and will not rule out using Blackwater and other private forces in Iraq, and that he will not sign on to Bernie Sanders and Jan Schakowsky's legislation, the Stop Outsourcing Security Act, which seeks to ban Blackwater and other private armed security companies from operating in U.S. war zones. And the reason is because Barack Obama does not actually have a plan to end the occupation. He has a plan to downsize it and rename it. But he is going to keep in place the Green Zone, the monstrous U.S. embassy that was built on slave labor, the largest embassy in the history of any nation in the world. He's going to keep control of the Baghdad International Airport, and he's going to maintain a residual strike force. And it says in his plan that it's going to strike at al-Qaeda, constantly using the language put out by the Bush administration. Al-Qaeda is not the issue in Iraq. There is an Iraqi resistance. Al-Qaeda represents less than 2,000 fighters inside of Iraq, primarily now based around Mosul. The idea that Al-Qaeda is the tip of the spear of the resistance in Iraq is ludicrous propaganda that was floated by Bush and apparently adopted by the Democrats now. And so Obama is going to keep in place the three places where Blackwater's bread is lathered with golden butter. And it's not because Barack Obama has any kind of great love for these companies. He was speaking out about this. I remind people that he was speaking out about this before Nisour Square. He called them unaccountable, above the law, a danger to U.S. troops. So why is he going to use them? Well, this is where it gets very complicated. In Iraq right now, in Baghdad alone, Blackwater, and this is a staggering statistic, Blackwater has 2/3 as many armed operatives as the United States State Department has diplomatic security agents in the entire world combined. To just repeat that, 2/3 as many armed operatives in Baghdad as the U.S. State Department Diplomatic Security Division has in the whole world combined, including in Iraq. They only have 36 diplomatic security agents in Iraq, and Blackwater has 2/3 as many as the whole force of 1,400 just in Baghdad. And so even if Obama wanted to fire Blackwater tomorrow, the question would come up, who's going to take it over? I used to think he would fire Blackwater and give it to another company. Talking to industry people, though, it appears as though Blackwater is really the only company that has the personnel to do this. And if Obama intends to keep this massive army of diplomats, they're going to need protection. The State Department doesn't have the staff to do it. The military said it doesn't want to come within 100 countries of that kind of mission because it will put more U.S. soldiers in direct conflict with Iraqis where their job is not hearts and minds or counterinsurgency, but to keep the VIP alive by any means necessary. You see, the dirty open secret in Washington right now is that Blackwater has done exactly what it was supposed to do. They are the shock troops of the occupation. Their job is to put the fear of God into Iraqis that have a thought of coming anywhere near the vehicle of the most important people in their country, U.S. officials, not Iraqis. And Blackwater has done its job effectively. And when Blackwater's owner was in front of the Congress, the Republicans said, when we talk about Blackwater, the number that matters is the number 0. 0 Americans killed or seriously injured under Blackwater's protection. That's what matters. That's what counts. And so the reality is that Obama, unless he radically changes his Iraq plan, is going to be giving these companies more business. If you ask the State Department, they'll say that it would take 2 to 3 years at a minimum, with the most aggressive funding and recruitment, to recruit, train, vet, and deploy a force the size of Blackwater's that are all U.S. government employees fully accountable under U.S. law. So at a bare minimum, Obama's going to have these guys working for him for at least 2 to 3 years of his administration, and in all likelihood, they're going to continue on. Obama also has a plan to send 7,000 more U.S. troops into Afghanistan. Blackwater does the same thing in Afghanistan that they do in Iraq, and they also work for the Drug Enforcement Agency, training the Afghan security forces, and somehow narco-trafficking is on the rise, not on the decrease, and Blackwater's on the job there, working through the DEA, training the Afghan security forces. And so business for these companies. And Blackwater is one of 630 corporations that are on the U.S. government payroll in Iraq. You know, I bet most people can't even name more than a handful of nations that even gave troops to Bush to be deployed in Iraq. It brought down the Spanish government. I was just there. Zapatero won because Aznar was one of the only lunatics on the international scene willing to voluntarily give Bush Spanish troops, give troops of his nation. Most countries had to be blackmailed, cajoled, bribed into doing. Aznar lined up. He was sort of the flea on Tony Blair the poodle being walked around by Bush, and his government fell because of it. But the reason that the Bush administration has this system in place that Blackwater thrives under is the reasons are many. First of all, you don't have to engage in any kind of international diplomacy anymore. You don't have to have a coalition of willing nations. You can just build a coalition of billing corporations. You can have 630 companies on the U.S. government payroll in Iraq with 180,000 personnel drawn from 100 countries around the world. Many of the people working for these companies as occupation forces in Iraq come from countries whose home governments are actually opposed to the war. Take the case of Chile. They had a seat on as a rotating member of the Security Council when the Iraq invasion was being planned and discussed. Chile said no to the war, we're against it. And so instead of working with the Chilean government to convince it or bribe it or blackmail it into sending troops, they used Blackwater to go in and hire Chilean commandos to then deploy them in Iraq in a war to which their home government is not a party and is in fact opposed to that war. And this system also keeps a draft off the table, which would make this thing politically untenable pretty darn fast, because people would get off of the YouTubes and the blogs and into the streets because it would be their potential necks on the line. And I'm totally against the draft. But I understand why Charlie Rangel of Harlem wants to implement a draft because he wants a democratization of who's getting killed. You know, the Bush twins run around writing children's books and going to galas and having their wedding, in Us Weekly and all that stuff, while poor Latino and African American and white folks are being sent over as cannon fodder for this war. And so it's the political expedience there, and on top of it, there's no laws that are being applied to these individuals. Their deaths and injuries don't get counted. It is essentially a shadow army that is operating in a covert manner. There's no accountability, and you're pouring money into the coffers of politically connected companies. It's been the greatest transfer of public funds to the private sector, I think, in the history of our country. We spend $2.3 to $2.8 billion every week occupying Iraq. 40 cents of every dollar that goes to the occupation of Iraq goes directly to the war corporations. So these companies now, over the past 5 years of occupation, have taken their billions and billions of dollars in no-bid contracts and crony contracts, and they've used it to build up their own private infrastructure. And so Blackwater is an interesting example in this equation. This company didn't exist 10 years ago. Now it's an incredibly powerful company, and what it's doing, first of all, Blackwater just reported record profits the last 2 quarters, and they're saying now we're going to be a full-spectrum operation. And what we've seen is this company build up an infrastructure parallel to the national security apparatus of the United States. Blackwater recently, one of its new projects, started a private intelligence company called Total Intelligence Solutions, and it's being run by 3 veterans of the CIA. At the top is J. Cofer Black. I have a whole chapter on him in my book. J. Cofer Black, 30-year veteran of the CIA. He ran the CIA's counterterrorism center on 9/11. This was the man who ran the Extraordinary Rendition Program, the government-sanctioned kidnap and torture program, where people are abducted in streets around the world, including here in the United States, and sent off to third-country hellholes to be tortured, sometimes while being interrogated with questions provided by U.S. interrogators like Maher Arar, who was abducted at JFK Airport and sent to Syria and tortured systematically. The number 2 man, he also was the guy who told Congress there's a before 9/11 and an after 9/11, and after 9/11 the gloves come off. His nickname in the Bush administration was the flies on the eyeball guy, because he said to the president, that's what's going to happen to the enemies of America when we're through with them. They're just going to have flies crawling across their eyeballs. The number 2 man is Robert Richer, former deputy director of operations at the CIA. Number 3, Enrique Rick Prado, a 10-year veteran of the CIA paramilitary division and a specialist in Latin America. They have people from the Defense Intelligence Agency, the FBI, others from the CIA, from military intelligence. They have an operations center based in Arlington, Virginia, which is modeled after the CIA's counterterrorism center. And Total Intelligence Solutions is marketing its services to Fortune 1000 corporations and foreign governments. And their literature literally says, we will bring CIA-type services into the boardroom. And Blackwater, in engaging in this private intelligence company, is entering a very lucrative arena and a fast-growing industry. Right now, the combined budgets of all 16 U.S. intelligence agencies are in the midst of the most radical privatization agenda in the history of U.S. intelligence. I mean, the whole nation, is every aspect of our life is being privatized. 70%, though, of the combined budget of these 16 U.S. intelligence agencies is in the hands of the private sector. 70%. We don't know the exact budget because it's a covert, it's a black budget. It's somewhere between $40 and $60 billion. But contractors are involved at every level of the U.S. intelligence apparatus, and they're simultaneously working for the U.S. government and supposedly protecting the United States, while at the same time working with for-profit corporations and foreign governments. And what's to stop them from injecting, if I were a traditional conservative, this is what would really make me outraged. What's to stop them from injecting tainted information into U.S. intelligence to benefit one of their clients or harm one of their competitors? There's almost no checks and balances at play here. And Blackwater now is entering that arena and is going to do, I'm sure, quite well in it. The second thing that Blackwater is working on right now is they're bidding on a share of a $15 billion contract with the U.S. Department of Defense to, quote, fight terrorists with drug trade ties. And the Wall Street Journal said it could be Blackwater's biggest job ever. I researched the program that they're applying for this contract under, and it's the Pentagon program that targets Colombia and Bolivia, as well as Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and a handful of other countries. Just to put this in a bigger context, Colombia is given $630 million by the United States military every year for the war on drugs, as they put it. Bogota is then told to hire U.S. war corporations to deploy in Colombia. And so DynCorp, this massive Walmart of private security, is actually being hired by Colombia using U.S. aid to deploy in Colombia. It's like a backdoor military deployment of the United States, but it's being done in a very perverse way through Bogota actually hiring a U.S. company to come and be there. Evo Morales of Bolivia also has DynCorp working, destroying coca leaves. He's a cocalero, and he has a U.S. mercenary company destroying coca crops because the U.S. says, if you don't do this and you don't have these guys there, you don't get any of the other aid. But we need to be clear here. This is not a war on drugs. This is a counterinsurgency war. It has been going back to the 1950s. When the CIA assassinated overthrew the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, the Contras, the death squads in El Salvador, Nicaragua, the war against the Zapatistas, the overthrow of Aristide, all of these events that took place in the Western Hemisphere since the 1950s have been about counterinsurgency and defending U.S. imperial interests and corporate interests as well. You think this is just coming from me? The United Nations Working Group on Mercenaries just did a report looking at the use of private security companies and identified a rapidly growing trend in Latin America of private security companies being used to defend transnational oil corporations against local populations who are angry about the exploitation of their natural resources. And so this would be a huge step for Blackwater to enter that arena. It would put them in a league with the godfathers or the dons of the war industry, like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and DynCorp, which is this massive company. And so their future looks very, very bright, regardless of who's in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. If Obama wins, his Iraq plan plays into their hands, his Afghanistan plan plays in their hands, and his rhetoric on Latin America. He's adopted, once again, the war on drugs rhetoric. It's not a war on drugs. And Obama is adopting it and talking about escalating the so-called war on drugs. And escalation means more work for these for-profit corporations. And so I want to begin to wrap up this part of it and open it up to discussion and questions and answers. And there's certainly a lot more that remains to be said. But I was just in San Diego recently, and I was visiting the U.S.-Mexico border, and I went and saw Duncan Hunter's apartheid wall to nowhere that juts out into the ocean. I've never seen anything like it. It's a wall that goes out into the ocean. I'm waiting for someone to spray paint Control-Alt-Delete on it. For the techies among us. But I went down there because Blackwater has just opened a brand new facility called Blackwater West in the city of San Diego, an area called Otay Mesa. And this was really a 2-year battle to open up this facility. Blackwater tried to open a private military base on 824 acres of land in Potrero, California, which is right near the U.S.-Mexico border with Tecate, Mexico. And they faced an uprising from a tiny town of 850 people who chased them out of town. And so if you don't think that grassroots activism of concerned citizens, of environmentalists, anti-war folks, and people who just don't want pollution, gunfire, and helicopters in their neighborhood, if you think that grassroots action cannot be effective, you just need to look at the history of what happened to Blackwater and Potrero. And Blackwater, when they pulled out of the deal, they said they had spent about $1 million on it, and they said, well, it just doesn't fit our business model. And they said it has nothing to do with the protests, right? Nothing to do with the protests, I'm sure. And then activists found out that Blackwater had, in fact, used a shell company to open a facility in San Diego itself, the 60,000 square foot warfare training center. And activists found that out, raised a ruckus about it, and the city of San Diego, to its credit, stood up to Blackwater and was fighting Blackwater on it. And so Blackwater did the logical thing you do when you want to respect the will of a local community. They went to a federal judge appointed by the president's father and asked her to intervene. So this federal judge ordered the city of San Diego to allow Blackwater to open its facility. And within hours of that decision, Blackwater had its first people in there with guns a-blazing. And so I went there with Nativo Lopez and with activists from San Diego, and we went to that facility on I think 72 hours after it opened, and they had a big rally outside of that facility, and the people of San Diego are standing up to it, and the city attorney of San Diego is also fighting Blackwater and trying to stop this intervention by a federal judge in what is ultimately a decision for the local people of San Diego. The reason that Blackwater is setting up shop in Southern California is abundantly clear. It's one of the epicenters of the debate about the Border Patrol. Blackwater has been part of a campaign pushing to privatize even greater the training of Border Patrol. Other companies have offered to provide the Homeland Security Department or ICE with privatized Border Patrols. It's also a huge military market. Blackwater also has a facility in Illinois called Blackwater North, which is along the Wisconsin-Iowa-Illinois border, and they're doing essentially paramilitary type training. They're also trying to open a facility in Idaho, and they're expanding as they go on. And Blackwater sort of tries to spin it this way. They say all this stuff about mercenary and everything. Well, all we're doing here is training. What does it mean when a company like this is doing training of local law enforcement? What are they teaching police officers? What are they teaching SWAT teams? This company, with its record, with its lack of transparency, with the scandals, the investigations, the killing of innocent people, that's who we want training police officers in the United States. And they train tens of thousands of law enforcement agents. Blackwater is one of the premier training companies. So when it comes to a community, remember, Blackwater started with the name Blackwater Lodge and Training Center. And fast forward, 10 years, and it's got its forces deployed in 9 countries around the world and is expanding inside of the United States. And I'll close by saying this, that even though we're in the midst of a very dark time, and I think a lot of people have enthusiasm for Barack Obama. Most of my best friends are in love with Barack Obama. They've guzzled the Obama Kool-Aid. I am not trying to break up anyone's engagement to Barack Obama. I just want to urge people to cheat on Barack Obama with a little bit of conscience on the war and on some of his foreign policy issues, because we basically as a country have between now and November to get anymore, except the people who are going to be around him as advisors, and many of them will probably be pretty right-wing people and belligerent pro-war type people, because we saw what happened during the Clinton era. And so it's important now that your voice is heard. And the group that I think has done the best job of staying above the partisan issues here and keeping their eyes on the ball have been the incredibly brave and courageous young men and women that make up Iraq Veterans Against the War. And I'll end this by just saying the 3 demands of Iraq Veterans Against the War. This is over 1,000 people who have served in the military since 9/11, many of them in Iraq and Afghanistan, including people on active duty. Number 1, immediate unconditional withdrawal of all occupation forces from Iraq. Number 2, payment of reparations to the Iraqi people. And number 3, adequate health and mental health benefits and treatment for veterans when they come back to this country. Thank you.
You've been listening to journalist and author Jeremy Scahill speaking about his book, Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer segment of this program. Jeremy Scahill is Puffin Foundation Writing Fellow at the Nation Institute. He is a frequent contributor to The Nation magazine and correspondent for the national radio and television program Democracy Now! His book, Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army, is now available in a fully revised and updated paperback edition. To find out more about Jeremy Scahill and his work, please visit the book's website at www.blackwaterbook.com. And now we return to the question and answer segment from Jeremy Scahill's presentation. He was speaking at Powell City of Books in Portland, Oregon on June 15th, 2008.
The question was boiled down to regarding Obama's suggestions of how to sort of reach out or have an impact on these issues. I think that grassroots organizations should form some kind of an open petition from Obama supporters saying we have problems with X, Y, and Z. And I think it's more powerful to do that in local communities at this point and let it build momentum. The other thing is, I have a friend who's going to be an Obama delegate. He's from Vermont, and he intends to make this part of the Vermont Party's platform. The other thing is Dennis Kucinich has delegates. And please, Dennis, don't sell out again like you did in 2004, where you traded everything for a speech at 4 o'clock in the afternoon when no one was watching. I think Dennis Kucinich is great. For the life of me, I can't understand why he made the decisions he did in 2004 to back off having an actual impact when they had the policy, the platform meetings. He essentially sold it in return for being able to speak at the convention, and it was a major problem. But it would be great if Kucinich, he bravely introduced the articles of impeachment. I think Kucinich could be used as a force to really raise a ruckus in Denver on the most pressing foreign policy issues, certainly, of our time. So I think it's very important, particularly for people who support Barack Obama, to make very clear that there are several of his policies that people find deeply, deeply disturbing, and that you want them changed. The question was if I had heard anything about Benazir Bhutto, the former prime minister of Pakistan, possibly being offered Blackwater's services, and if it was turned down shortly before she was assassinated. Yes, there are two sort of conflicting versions here. One is that she tried to hire Blackwater and that the Musharraf government blocked it. The other is that she tried to hire Blackwater and the State Department, the U.S. State Department, blocked it. Now, I don't know what Blackwater's involvement, if any, was. If it was specifically Blackwater, other sources have indicated that it was a different company. But I've heard from several people that it was in fact Blackwater and that it was turned down by either the Musharraf government or the U.S. State Department. But that really is all I know right now. The question is, he sees Obama as trying to go after the lazy Congress and the lobbyists. If he's playing politics, he's playing it with very, very dangerous issues right now. I mean, I think a lot of Obama supporters say, oh, well, Obama has to say these things to get elected. They say these things and then they do them or they do it worse. And, when Samantha Power, one of his advisors, made the mistake of actually telling the truth on BBC and saying, well, we're saying these things now, but we're actually going to figure out our Iraq plan once we win. I do think that that's the mentality of the campaign. And as much as anyone may have personal respect for Barack Obama's integrity and believe in him, this is going to become much bigger than him immediately. He's going to have, who's his vice president going to be? His national security advisor, his secretary of state. He'll talk to the military commanders. I mean, this morning I was watching Fareed Zakaria and all of the insiders talking on CNN about this, and they were all saying, Michael Hanlon and all these people that know so much about so little, or so little about so much, or something like that, and have been wrong about everything basically from day one. But they were saying that that Obama is going to have to radically change his Iraq plan, and these are Democratic strategists, and they're saying, and we fully expect that he's going to do that. No, I think Obama is playing politics. His statements on Israel-Palestine were outrageous. His rhetoric on Iran is devastatingly dangerous. His Iraq plan is not a plan to end the occupation. His rhetoric on Latin America plays directly into the hands of those that wish to smash the rights of indigenous communities throughout Latin America. If he's just saying these things for political purposes, I think it's a very, very dangerous game that he's playing, and I think that he needs to be confronted by supporters. I do think that he intends to mop out a lot of the corruption within the Congress. I think he's one of the more aggressive legislators. His time in Washington, he's introduced more bills than many senators do in their entire career. But the fact of the matter is that on some of the most serious issues of our day, Obama has policies that are, I quite frankly, really disturbing. So I don't know. I don't see much in the way of great change happening in that regard. The question was if I see the privatization of the National Guard by Blackwater. What I would just say in a bigger sense of it, every part of our life is being privatized right now. I mean, this is far and away the most radical privatization agenda in U.S. history. They defund schools and they underpay teachers, and they say, well, the schools are failing, so we need to privatize them. The prisons are being privatized. Eric Prince, the owner of Blackwater, is involved with a faith-based Christian prison in Sugar Land, Texas. He works with Chuck Colson, Nixon's hatchet man during Watergate. The two of them work together, and they run this faith-based prison in Sugar Land, Texas. The military is being privatized. This was Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld's life's work. On the issue of the National Guard, I think it all will start with training. They'll first start working as trainers, but it's not. You have to understand, Blackwater is like a high-end boutique on a strip full of Walmarts. It's not the biggest, it's not the most profitable. It's in their eyes they're simply the best, but even within the industry they're viewed as the most elite. Their training program as well as their personnel. Yes, they've hired forces from all around the world in a classic mercenary sense, but they also have a fair percentage of their operators who are former U.S. Navy SEALs, Delta Force guys, Special Forces guys, who are some of the most highly trained soldiers in world history. And I think it starts slow at first, and then it metastasizes. And Blackwater's own history has shown that it all started with the training, and now they are training federal forces in this country, and they're competing with the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, which is the government training program, to win these contracts. So I do think that whether it's Blackwater or another company, we're going to see more and more privatized forces domestically in the U.S. Indeed, we already are, and we saw it clearly in Hurricane Katrina. Is there a woman that I just want to have some democracy here about women and being able to ask questions also? Yeah. Who would be my choice for the president? You know, I sort of, the way I kind of view it is that I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. I'm a journalist, but maybe that's a bit of a cop out. In all candor, I'm really torn about this situation because I think that. I think had Hillary Clinton been the nominee, there would have been a very different space that would have been more conducive to a discussion about multi-party politics. Ralph Nader is running for president. Bob Barr is running for president. Cynthia McKinney will quite likely be the Green Party nominee. I read a very fascinating essay by one of her supporters the other day in talking about how it's a totally ignored campaign, and yet this is a former congressperson who's an African-American woman running for president. I think that Pat Buchanan the other day, the right-wing xenophobic, crazy Pat Buchanan, who also is against a lot of wars, he said something that I found really chilling coming out of his mouth. He said that John McCain could make Dick Cheney look like Gandhi. So, I mean, I believe that what we desperately need in this country is a multi-party system. We need to break this one-party stranglehold on control of the country. We don't have two parties. We have, we have a loyal opposition at best in the Democrats. And so, I'm going to wait and see what unfolds with these third-party candidacies. I completely reject the notion that Ralph Nader lost the 2000 election. I think people who say that have no idea what they're talking about. Then if you believe that, then you should really be going after Monica Moorhead, who is the Socialist Workers' Party candidate, because she also got enough votes that would have swayed it, according to that logic. You know who lost the 2000 election? Al Gore and Donna Brazile and all those people that decided not to stand up when the election was stolen and to back down off of it. So I think this year that the strategic voting in non-swing states, it's very important that we get some progressive party, 5% or more, so that they can start getting some federal funding. Maybe this isn't the year that that's going to happen. I think a lot of people believe in Obama. He's engendered a tremendous amount of energy and optimism, and I understand why people are supporting him. I don't know that that's what I personally believe in, but I think that there's nothing but good about the fact that all of these people are being turned on to politics. I mean, Nader himself says, if you don't get turned on to politics, politics will turn on you. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that statement, and we have to be very careful in how we treat the times that we're in. It's not just about this election. It also has to do with building an actual movement or building a base of people that believe in these issues and believe in justice. And to me, that's more important than who we're going to vote for, is that we do something with this energy now that leads to reclaiming some semblance of democracy in this country. Yeah. The question is with Presidential Directive 51 if Blackwater would be strong enough to confront people if they go out into the streets. Now, I was asked the other day in New York by someone, do you think that these guys would ever, organize a coup? Would that we had a political leader in Washington that these guys would think they had to overthrow. And the thing is, how would a coup look any different right now? We would have a right-wing Christian supremacist in power, giving all of our tax dollars to crony corporations. No, but I think that we've had a quiet coup in this country already. They're already winning. We now officially live in a corporatist state. It's a hollow government and a hollow military. In Iraq, the contractors are greater in scope than the actual forces. The budgets of social programs in this country are being put on the chopping block every day. The military budget is more bloated than it's ever been in the history of this country. And it used to be that corporations had influence over U.S. policy. Now it's that the corporations are actually setting the policy and then implementing it on the ground. It's the full spectrum corporatism is really what we're seeing here. And so, we have legislation in this country, the Anti-Pinkerton Act, which goes back to the 1800s. I think it was passed in 1852 or 1884, something like that. And what it says is that the U.S. government cannot work with a paramilitary or quasi-paramilitary organization. And yet we've seen the government consistently using these forces in the United States and outside of the United States also. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans turned into the Baghdad on the Bayou. These guys just poured in all the companies that were in Iraq. And so I think that we're seeing the emergence of a Frankenstein Pinkerton agency, and it's not just one company, it's many companies. And ironically, Blackwater executives on numerous occasions have actually compared their company to the Pinkertons. The Vice President of Blackwater, Martin Strong, said, how do you think Abraham Lincoln got to his inauguration? He had to be escorted by the Pinkertons, and we're like the Pinkertons. I mean, yeah, you are. And the Pinkertons, you can't hire the Pinkertons now, and we shouldn't be able to hire you. So the short answer to your question is I think that it's not just about Blackwater. It's that private forces have consistently, throughout U.S. history, been used to suppress dissent, go after the labor movement, and the law enforcement community is being totally privatized in this country, the training and the operations. So it's sort of take your pick of the company. They just have different logos, same concept. Yeah.
The next question for Jeremy Scahill is about the use of Blackwater personnel domestically, specifically in New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina. Was there any legal fallout from that deployment of Blackwater here in the United States?
All right, well, I went down to New Orleans not to investigate Blackwater. I went there to cover the aftermath of the flooding of the city, and I happened to be talking to two New York City police officers in the French Quarter when an unmarked car pulled up next to us, and these three massive guys got out of it, 3 or 4 of them with M4 assault rifles, Glock 9 pistols strapped to their legs, and they came up to the cops and said, "Where are the rest of the Blackwater guys?" And I was kind of taken aback and didn't even hear what the police officers said. And then they got back in their car and they drove away. And I said to the cops, Blackwater like the guys in Iraq and Afghanistan? And they said, yeah, they're all over the place down here. And so I found Blackwater guys like 5 minutes after that. I just walked a little bit down the street and they were standing in the middle of the street. And I talked to a handful of them for about 45 minutes or an hour. And they told me that they were there to confront criminals and stop looters. Some of them had just been in Iraq 2 weeks earlier. One guy said, when they told me I was going to New Orleans, I said, what country is that in? And they were saying there was not enough action here. And one of them flashed a gold badge, because I was like, well, under whose authority are you operating here? And one of them flashed a gold badge, and said I was deputized by the governor of the state of Louisiana and authorized to use lethal force if I deem it necessary. Well, what I later found out is that Eric Prince, the owner of Blackwater, sent his forces into New Orleans before any agency of the federal government really was there, and he did it with no contract, with no government contract. He literally just decided that it was okay to send men with M4 assault rifles onto the streets of a U.S. city with a Puma helicopter and just sort of fan out into the night. And only after they were there for a few days were they actually hired by the Department of Homeland Security. So to me, that actually is one of the most disturbing aspects of that story, and I found it out after I had done this, is that they actually went there with no official government contract and just decided we're going to send men with guns onto the streets of a U.S. city. And it's a great leap of faith to say, oh, well, these guys they'll totally protect the peace, And Michael Ratner, from the Center for Constitutional Rights, one of the great heroes of our society, who really spearheaded the effort about habeas corpus in Guantanamo, they were looking at this issue, and Ratner was saying, where is any assurance in this equation that these guys have any constitutional rights protection training? That they have in any way any knowledge of what people's civil and human and constitutional rights are when they encounter them. But there hasn't been any litigation on this that I'm aware of. Blackwater was in fact hired then by the Department of Homeland Security, Federal Protective Service, and they billed U.S. taxpayers $950 per man per day. And the Blackwater guys told me that they were getting paid $350 a day to be down there. So at one point, Blackwater was pulling in about $240,000 a day. They made over $70 million from the Hurricane Katrina operations, and in fact started a whole new division of the company based on the experience there, a domestic operations division. It raises questions about posse comitatus, about martial law. What's the difference between having former Navy SEALs or current Navy SEALs being deployed on the streets of a U.S. city with these, assault rifles? In fact, I mean, you have less of an opportunity for any kind of oversight or checks and balances when it's a private organization. We have enough trouble overseeing the official business of official forces in the U.S. when you add to it the layers of secrecy that shroud these private companies. It really becomes a quite disturbing reality.
The next question was a follow-up to the suggestion that presidential candidate Barack Obama should be pressured on issues like the Iraq War and the use of contractors like Blackwater. What leverage does the general public have when the Obama election team surely knows that the alternative is John McCain, who is almost certainly much worse than Obama on these and many other issues? They know that this constituency will not vote in a way that risks giving the election to McCain.
I mean, the point, though, I mean, what we learned in the 2004 elections is that the Democrats have a PhD in losing elections. And John Kerry pandered to the right, and ultimately he lost. To me, this isn't just, well, first of all, I would argue fiercely that if he's elected, after that, you're going to have exponentially less. You're going to be of exponentially less importance to Barack Obama than you are now. He needs money from people. He needs support. He needs you out there trying to convince independent voters, people on the left. He's also going to try to have to shore up support of independent, unaffiliated people, Hillary Clinton supporters. So don't just assume that Obama's counting on everybody to vote for him. He's got a real battle on his hands to fight over some of Hillary Clinton's bloc with John McCain. But on a strategic level, I think it is a political mistake of Barack Obama to have positions as far to the right as he has on these issues. And I think we learned that lesson in a very clear way from John Kerry's pathetic run for president in 2004, where he just constantly tried to out-conservative Bush at every turn. I'm not just saying this about, so that people kind of, spit in the ocean. I think it's a strategic mistake for Barack Obama not to run on a more fiercely progressive platform. I just think that history shows that that's running away from the actual base, and I think it would energize people more if he did that rather than trying to sort of show John McCain he's tough. He's gonna obliterate John McCain in those debates, and he should have morality on his side as well, in addition to just being a much better talker and probably a better person than McCain.
As a follow-up, the audience member emphasized that for this strategy to work, Obama has to believe that he might lose votes because of his position on these issues, and that just isn't very likely.
It's not just that he thinks that he's going to lose you. It has to do with if enough of his supporters, his delegates, start raising this issue, it becomes an issue for his campaign. I heard through another source that there are shouting matches in their foreign policy circle over the issue of Iraq. There is disillusionment within the campaign as well over it because people are concerned. One of his national campaign co-chairs is Jan Schakowsky, a founding member of the Out Now caucus. That's not Barack Obama's position. So don't assume that it's just about he needs to think that you're not going to vote for him. It's a matter of bolstering the view and the position of people within the campaign who are more closely aligned with a firm anti-war position. It's not just about Obama as a man. It's the campaign realizing that a substantial portion of the voters are aware of this and don't like it. And that will empower people within the campaign to raise this issue in a more serious and substantive way with him because it shows a base of people, not just sort of random opinion polls. Yes.
The next question for Jeremy Scahill asks whether he knows of any global movement to put pressure on a new U.S. administration on the issue of the expanded use of private military contractors.
No. I mean, I think there's a great deal of anxiety in capitals around the world about the issue of the privatization of war, because what does it say when you have companies that have the manpower, firepower, the human power, the firepower, the weaponry to take out a small national military? There are 177 mercenary companies in Iraq alone right now. That's almost as many nations as there are registered at the UN. And so the global scene has changed quite dramatically over the past 10 years. And I think it's concerning a lot of governments. The UN is investigating this, but the United Nations has never been in a weaker position in its history than it is right now. And that has a lot to do with the smear campaign waged against international diplomacy by the Bush White House. And that would be the logical body that would take it up. But to my knowledge, there's only been a very narrowly focused working group on mercenaries that's even remotely looking at the issues raised by this system. Yes, ma'am.
The next audience member described two local community organizing efforts related to the U.S. wars and occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan. The first is a local effort to have Portland, Oregon become a sanctuary city for GI resistors, U.S. soldiers who refuse to deploy to Iraq or Afghanistan, or in other ways refuse to serve in the occupations. The second is a campaign to keep the Oregon National Guard from being deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan, a campaign that has counterparts in other states, most notably in Vermont. She urged other members of the audience to find out more about these campaigns and to become involved. Jeremy Scahill summarized the other topics she asked about.
Right. Well, first of all, thank you for suggesting what you did locally here. I hadn't heard anyone talk about that sanctuary city idea, but I know that Canada now is officially taking that up, and a lot of the vets groups are happy about that. You just asked two questions with very long answers, so I'll sort of give a very short version of it. I mean, and you didn't explain to anybody else what it's about, so now I have to explain what you're actually even asking. She was asking about the update on the Caspian Sea and also Blackwater's push to try to be used as a privatized peacekeeping force. The short of it with the Caspian Sea is that Blackwater, beginning in 2005, was sent into Azerbaijan, which borders Iran in the Caspian Sea. And they were sent into the port city of Baku, which juts out into the Caspian Sea, to set up what was it used to be a Soviet special forces base, and Blackwater took it over, renovated it, and remodeled it after the Department of Homeland Security Command and Control Center. And they trained a high-end unit of the Azerbaijani military, navy, and then deployed it in the Caspian Sea. And the Iranians took this as a direct threat, essentially, and deployed a special unit of the Iranian Navy into the Caspian Sea. And I mean, I've been looking at this facility to see its possible value for use as a forward operating base in any kind of an attack against Iran. And the reason that Blackwater was sent in there is because Rumsfeld had this thing where he went all around Central Asia and made these agreements with these undemocratic, dictatorships, basically, to allow the U.S. to use these companies to engage in military operations in the Middle East. And Blackwater was used, and the company itself describes it as a small footprint approach, where you send in a small team from a private company rather than the big U.S. military to work with local forces, bolster them up, set up this facility that quite clearly could have future use in any attack against Iran. And I've been checking the contract data on that, and it's like fallen off the map. And it's really hard to get any information about what that facility is being used for. The second one, and I'll try to just say this very briefly, Blackwater for quite a while now has been pushing to be sent into Darfur as a privatized peacekeeping force. And they say if you send us in, it'll be John Jaweed be gone. And in fact, today in the very right-wing New York Sun, there's an op-ed that I really for a moment thought that I was reading The Onion. It was this guy was suggesting that the new head of peacekeeping at the UN have a cocktail hour with Mia Farrow and Eric Prince, the owner of Blackwater, sort of a marriage of opposites. That it was. Check it out, but. I almost don't even know what to say about it, but the point was, this is a right and left issue. Both teams are on board with this, and why not use Blackwater, this great company, to go in and save the suffering people and kill the bad guys? I mean, are these people serious? Look at the record of this company. What is needed in Darfur now is less guns in the hands of private forces. And you're going to send in a notorious company with a reputation for killing civilians that they're supposedly there to liberate? I mean, what are these people thinking when they come up with this idea? Blackwater refers to itself now as operating in the peace and stability industry. Their men are called global stabilization professionals. I mean, this is it is truly Orwellian, and it is shameful that there has not been a more pronounced and passionate response to what's been happening in Darfur. Bill Richardson, though, who knows that issue well, said a number of times during the debate, and it went way over the heads of the moderators or the other candidates. But Richardson was a sharp guy on this issue. He was talking about how if you look at this, China is in control of Sudan's oil market. If the United States really wanted to stop it, they could do it in an instant. And the U.S. does not stand up to China. There's all sorts of reasons why the Darfur conflict is continuing. And these people who say, well, Blackwater could go in and stop it, those aren't serious people. And I don't even think they're seriously opposed to it. I think they just view the UN peacekeeping budget as the next feeding trough for these corporations. Yeah. The question was about peak oil. The honest truth of it is that I haven't had it. That gets raised a lot in these discussions. I haven't had a chance to investigate it enough. I mean, my life's sort of been like being John Malkovich. When John Cusack walks into the restaurant, everybody's saying Malkovich, Malkovich, Malkovich. It's like Blackwater, Blackwater, Blackwater. So in all candor, I haven't had a chance to look into it, but it seems like a very important issue to study. Yeah.
If you read Brzezinski, who's advising Obama,
right.
Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, makes it very clear. If the United States is to maintain itself as an empire, it needs to control Middle Eastern oil and Central Asian oil.
Yeah.
That's Caspian Sea.
I have a whole chapter on exactly what you're talking about.
So that means if they want to privatize or surreptitious taking over of those oil fields using privatization.
Well, they've already done that.
Then
Clinton did this.
There's the completion. And 9/11 was the catalyst for it. Because they said...
It happened before 9/11.
Yeah, but barring another Pearl Harbor, we don't see the American people being willing to support that kind of...
American people are totally oblivious that it even happened. It happened in the 1990s. I mean, this was a major initiative of the Clinton White House. The contracts went through, Clinton pushed it through. I mean, this wasn't something that was like a raging debate in the United States. The American people have no clue that the United States has been dealing in the Caspian Sea with the Central Asian republics, in Azerbaijan and Georgia. I mean, all of this stuff was in motion for a long, long time. I don't see a 9/11 connection to that issue at all. It was part of the long-standing U.S. agenda, and the reality was that it was backed up by major, powerful corporations, and they worked with these fragile regimes and ultimately pushed it through. Rumsfeld comes in and starts these pipeline protection programs working with the Georgian military forces. They ultimately overthrew the government in Georgia, put in place a U.S. neoliberal ally. I don't see 9/11 in that at all. I think it was very much a long-standing bipartisan agenda of the power elite. Yes. The question was, have I talked to Blackwater members and what the individual view is of Blackwater by Blackwater members? I mean, there's not any one view. It'd be like saying, what's the view of people in this room of issue X? I mean, we're going to have a ton of different viewpoints. I just the other night I met a Blackwater guy who came to one of my events, and he, I mean, that's happened to me quite a bit. And one of the chilling things that has happened is when Blackwater guys come up to me and say, either I've read your book or I've read portions of your book, and you don't even know 5%. It's worse than you think it is. And I mean, yeah, it might, but it's chilling. But this guy who was working with Blackwater in New Orleans, he injected himself into a conversation I was having with some people after the event, and someone was asking me what was the legal structure that they were operating under in New Orleans, and he says, we didn't think that there were any laws that applied to us. And we started talking, and he's a veteran himself, and he got hired by Blackwater because he's a canine specialist. He works in there. He's a specialist with attack dogs, and was working for them. And he said, they keep trying to hire me and send me back. He's like, it's terrible. I wouldn't want to work for them ever again. You have other people that swear by the company, that feel that what they're doing is a patriotic extension of their service in the military, and that finally they're getting paid real money to do what they were paid squat to do, with their necks on the line for 15 years in U.S. Special Forces in serious combat, and that what they're doing is continuing to serve their country. And I think you have everything in between. I think you have a lot of people that for financial reasons join up with these companies. One of the things I took great care in doing when I wrote the book was to try to tell the story of a couple of individual people who worked for Blackwater, their whole background, who they were, why they joined up with it. And these guys weren't evil bastards who were out to just slaughter everybody in sight. I mean, the chapter about Scott Helvenston describes how this guy was a Navy SEAL, the youngest person to complete the BUDS training program, the Navy SEAL training program, who was having trouble making ends meet. His life was kind of in financial shambles, and he ultimately heard through the grapevine of former Navy SEALs that this company was hiring, and he could make $60,000 in 2 months, and he'd be guarding Ambassador Paul Bremer, and he could get back into the game. And he wanted to go over for 2 months, make money, and come back and sort of put his life back together. And he ends up getting killed the second day that he was in Iraq after he was sent into Fallujah. He was one of the 4 guys killed on March 31st, 2004. So, if you read my book, I think you'll see that I am tremendously critical of the company. But I think that it's very complicated why people sign up for these jobs. A lot of the folks that work for KBR in Iraq are poor folks from the South in the United States. The truck drivers who go over there for financial reasons, they're in debt. Look at the economy right now in this country with almost $5 gasoline, the cost of food rising. They're taking advantage of people economically, and that's what they're doing when they go into Latin American countries too. They're taking advantage of people's economic situation to place them in a very hostile war zone that ultimately is about defending corporate interests. So it's across the board, and I also think you have some really sick, sadistic individuals who go over there just to kill people. Yeah, yes, ma'am.
Does that seem like a fair...
She's asking about Eisenhower's farewell address in 1961, I believe it was, right, 61. And when Eisenhower talked about the rise of the military-industrial complex and the dangers of unchecked power, But in rereading it, he was talking about a time coming out of World War II and really the escalation of the so-called Cold War, when it was actually weapons manufacturers, the creators of hardware, of aircraft, of tanks. And now it's really just the box the Pandora's box has just been yanked open, and it's actually, in the words of Joe Wilson, whose wife was outed as a CIA operative. Joe Wilson said, you have a very well-funded special interest group in these companies, and a special interest group that is in fact armed. And yeah, I mean, I think this is the embodiment of everything that Eisenhower warned against. And Blackwater is sort of a metaphor for how out of control it is.
As a follow-up, Jeremy Scahill was asked, how can we get to the root of this problem?
Well, look, we would need to have several hundred different people calling themselves congressmen and women in Washington. No one in the Congress, not even some of the most progressive Congress people, will do anything to take on what the root of this problem is. We have a system in this country that weds corporate profits with an escalation of violence. And it's that wedding of those two things, which have no business being related. Not only wedding, but they're having one hell of a honeymoon. And it's a dangerous honeymoon, and a lot of people are being killed, and a lot of democratic institutions are being threatened or destroyed. And so it would require it is metastasized so quickly. It's like trying to fight cancer with a metal detector. It is metastasized so fast and so far, and it's now to the point where the corporations are more powerful than many government institutions. And I mean, to me, it would just require an entirely different set of people legislating in this country, and different justices on the Supreme Court, and different commanders in the military. Not going to happen. All right, we can take one more, and then I'm happy to talk to people too after this, but I think we have to wrap it up around now. Go ahead. John, the question was about John Cusack, and did he consult with me for his new movie? John is a good friend of mine. John Cusack's a good friend of mine, and I did meet with him when he was making his movie War Inc. I met with him and Marissa Tomei, and there were a few of us that were independent journalists that were sort of talking to John about different aspects when he was working on his movie War Inc., which just came out. What was kind of funny about John Cusack is that John Cusack is a formidable analyst on these issues. He's not just like a Hollywood actor who knows a couple of things. Like, John Cusack is a force to be reckoned with in a debate, and I would put him out there against any of these characters to debate them. He knows his stuff. He's extremely well read. But what happened was that John Cusack started calling all of these independent journalists who'd been going in and out of Iraq when the invasion started. People, I know so many people would just get this call from John Cusack, and the point of him calling was he just wanted to ask what's happening, what's this, can you explain to me who this was? He was and he wasn't thinking of a film at the time. He just wanted to know, and he was fed up with CNN, so he just started calling me, Naomi Klein, other people, and that's really how I got to know John. And now we talk about projects and stuff, and I think it's great that he's not just using his platform as a very well-respected A-list actor who's sort of adored by, many, many young women. But he engages in a very, very serious, deep political discourse on shows that never do that. And so to me, there was a real coup here in having Cusack make the rounds on all the Leno shows and be talking about radical privatization of the war machine, Blackwater, DynCorp, Halliburton, all these things. I mean, kudos to John Cusack, because it's sort of like, and I said this at one point, it's sort of like, in Say Anything, he's standing outside of the house with the boombox playing the Peter Gabriel song. Now it's kind of like John Cusack has like this ratty television standing outside of Hollywood saying, hey, pay attention here. So, and on that note, thank you all very much for coming. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
You've been listening to journalist and author Jeremy Scahill speaking about his book, Blackwater: The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. To find out more about Jeremy Scahill and his work, please visit his book's website at www.blackwaterbook.com. This program was produced by pdxjustice Media Productions. To find out more about this presentation and our many other video and audio programs, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. You'll find lectures and interviews featuring speakers such as Susan Faludi, P. Synoth, Phyllis Bennis, Amira Haas, Paul Krugman, Noam Chomsky, Natalie Angier, and many others. And if you'd like to find out more about the Portland GI Resistance Sanctuary Campaign, or the efforts to stop the deployment of National Guard troops to Iraq and Afghanistan, contact information for the campaigns will also be available through the posting for this lecture at the PDX Justice Media Productions website. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots, democratic, community media.
Shooting that day from those armored vehicles were not members of the United States military on active duty. They weren't members of Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army or al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. They were private forces working for Blackwater. And what happened after this played out in the international media. The Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki was under the mistaken impression that he actually was in charge of the country, and the Iraqi government ordered Blackwater as a company to leave Iraq. And the Iraqi judicial system indicated that it intended to prosecute the shooters as they would any criminal who had committed this kind of an act in the country. Of course, things are not so simple. Nouri al-Maliki is not the Prime Minister of Iraq. Condoleezza Rice apparently is. And Jalal Talabani is not the president. George Bush apparently is. And so the Bush administration got on the phone, ostensibly to offer an apology, but more importantly to read the riot act to its puppet regime in Baghdad. And for 3 days, Blackwater's work was in fact shut down while this crisis played out, this what was described as a diplomatic crisis between Baghdad and Washington. And on the fourth day, Blackwater's operatives were armed and back on the streets of Iraq again, and it became perhaps the most potent symbol of the utter lack of sovereignty in Iraq that Blackwater's men were back on the streets. In fact, we learned just how deeply embedded and how central to the U.S. occupation Blackwater is when those 3 days went down that Blackwater wasn't working. No U.S. officials could go anywhere. No non-military officials could go anywhere. An Iraqi friend of mine said they turned the green zone into the green zoo because they were all essentially trapped in there with the Cinnabons and the espressos and Burger King. But what's important to understand here is how the White House responded to this. Now, Blackwater works on a U.S. State Department contract. A lot of people believe that Blackwater works for the military. Blackwater does not work for the military. Blackwater works directly for the White House. Which means that it's outside of the military command structure, and it also means that, in the words of Congressman Dennis Kucinich, it is effectively an armed wing of the administration operating in Iraq. And so Blackwater guards the State Department in Iraq, and the individuals tasked with investigating, quote unquote, Blackwater right away after this were in fact State Department personnel who depended on Blackwater to keep them alive while they were investigating Blackwater. Now, if you or I were accused of killing anyone or crimes of a much less serious nature, if we're lucky in this country, we would be read something called the Miranda rights. We'd be told we had the right to remain silent, that anything we say can and will be used against us in a court of law. When State Department investigators interviewed the individuals at the center of this shooting, they gave them something called limited use immunity. And what this effectively said was that nothing you say to us in this investigation can and will be used against you in a court of law, and none of the information gleaned from the interview with you can be used to bring criminal charges against you, sort of like a reverse Miranda right. Just to put this in a historical context, that's how Oliver North got off. He was given limited use immunity to testify in front of the United States Congress about Iran-Contra, and then his lawyers later effectively argued that there would not have been a prosecution of him would not have been possible had the prosecutors not used Dr. Jawad. He also was a doctor. Medicine was very much in this family's DNA, and in fact, they had made a conscious decision to remain in Iraq. Like some fortunate Iraqis, they had the opportunity to leave their country when the U.S. invaded, and they decided not to do that because, as a family, they believed that their services as medical professionals would be needed more than ever in their country as it was preparing to absorb a barrage of violence and chaos. And so this family stayed, and on this particular day, when Ahmed was driving his mother, Mahassan, they were running errands. Among the errands they were running was dropping off college applications for Ahmed's younger sister, and they pulled into the Mansour neighborhood, and at the time they were approaching a major intersection. A convoy of armored vehicles was careening down the wrong side of a one-way road. and Iraqi police officers in the square that day, which was Nisr Square, scrambled to cut off traffic. This is common in Iraq. When the most important people in Iraq come careening down the road, the Iraqi police have to stop traffic. And of course, the most important people in Iraq are not Iraqis, they are U.S. VIPs. And so on this day, when these armored vehicles were coming into the square and Ahmed and his mother were pulling into the square, the men inside of the armored vehicles decided that they viewed Ahmed Haytham al-Rubai and his mother Mahassan as potential terrorists or car bombers, and they decided to shoot Ahmed Haytham al-Rubai in his head. And after they shot him, his mother began shrieking. And we know this from the testimony, and I write about this in the book, of eyewitnesses that day. She started shrieking and grabbing onto her son and hollering, help me, my son, my son. And 2 Iraqi police officers responded, and they describe how they tried to pull her out of the vehicle, and that her grip was so tight on her son's body that they couldn't get her out. And they saw that the men in the armored vehicles were once again training their weapons on the car, and they were concerned that more shots were going to come, and the Iraqi police officers held up their hands to show that they themselves were not armed, but also to try to make clear that what they were doing was trying to get this woman out of the car. And then it became apparent to the Iraqi police officers that more shots, gunfire rained down on that vehicle, and witnesses say that the car exploded and burst into flames, burning Mahassan and her son Ahmed inside of the vehicle. That kicked off 15 minutes of very heavy gunfire at Nisr Square that day, and it lasted about, as I say, a quarter of an hour. At the end of it, 17 Iraqi civilians were dead. Among the other victims was a 9-year-old boy named Ali, who was shot in his head, and his father described having his hand over his son's heart and still feeling it beating, and running to a hospital trying to save his son's life, and then arriving there and the doctors telling him that there was nothing that they could do, that his son was dead. And this man's name was Mohammed. He returned the next day to gather pieces of his son's skull that he could find in the square, because he wanted to try to bury as much of the body as he could find in the Iraqi holy city of Najaf. Children were killed that day, women were killed that day. In fact, several people who survived, and also some who were killed, were shot in the back as they tried to flee the scene. And the individuals who did the Well, thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Teresa, for that warm introduction and for the work that the folks at KBOO do. It's so important to defend independent media and to keep community media outlets alive, and I'm honored always to be on the airwaves of KBOO, and I'm truly honored to be here at Powell's, because we desperately need a response to these behemoth corporations and an independent way to distribute books so that it's not also going for nefarious activities of mega corporations. So thank you to the folks here at Powell's for everything that you do. I want to begin at the outset here by just embarrassing someone who I've actually never met, but my good friend Sophie Ragsdale, who's a colleague of mine at The Nation. I understand her dad is here, and I just wanted to wish him a happy Father's Day from his daughter in person. So happy Father's Day, Mr. Ragsdale. Wherever you are. I want to begin just by apologizing if some of the things that I talk about tonight are already known to you. I'm sure that there are many of you in this room that follow these events and incidents very closely, and some of the territory that I'm going to cover tonight you may already be aware of, so sorry in advance if some of what I tell you already knew. In the updated version of my book, I have about 130, 140 pages of completely new material. And then I went through the book and I updated some of the key facts surrounding the congressional investigation into Blackwater, as well as some of the lawsuits that have been filed against the company, but also looking at the lethal, deadly events of the past year, as well as ending the book with a new chapter called Blackwater Beyond Bush that looks at the future of these companies and what's at stake in the 2008 presidential election. But I want to begin by telling a story that I'm sure all of you heard about and followed, and it happened last year on the afternoon of September 16th, 2007, in Baghdad, in an area called the Mansour district. And it was an area that I knew well. I've been there many times in my travels to Iraq, and it used to be a real upscale part of the Iraqi capital, and now it's a sort of a hollow shell of its former self. But on this particular day, a 20-year-old Iraqi medical student named Ahmed Haytham al-Rubai was driving in a car with his mother, Mahasin, the family's white Opel sedan. His mother also was a doctor, and they had just dropped off his father. Evidence that was gained from his protected testimony in front of the Congress. So that was the first thing that the Bush administration did, was to immunize the suspects in the worst massacre of Iraqi civilians committed by a U.S.-funded private force in Iraq, to immunize them from any form of effective prosecution. Now, the Blackwater version of events around this time emerged. Blackwater said we were victims of an armed ambush by insurgents and enemies, and they said that our men were nobly defending American lives in a hostile war zone. They have a sort of ready-made press release that almost always says the same thing when things go lethally wrong in Iraq. And so Blackwater's version was out there. The Iraqi government did its investigation and said that there was no one shooting at the Blackwater men. This was an unprovoked attack, and you had those two stories kind of playing out. Then Blackwater and its allies alleged that perhaps members of the Iraqi police or military had engaged in an attack on Blackwater in addition to the armed insurgents and enemies, etc. And so we were off to the races. Now, Blackwater's allies in the media started spinning a story, and Blackwater's owner picked up on this, that you can't trust anything that the Iraqi government says because the investigation was done by the Interior Ministry, which is a hotbed of sectarianism under the direct control of Muqtada al-Sadr, and you can't believe anything that comes out of the mouths of the Iraqis, despite the fact that U.S. liaisons work at the Interior Ministry. The Bush administration promotes this as a sovereign government. Blackwater and its friends were saying, you can't believe anything the Iraqis are saying. And then one day, we get word that something called the First Blush Report of the State Department was being leaked. And when we read it in the media, it was a piece of paper that had the official seal of the United States State Department on it, and it defended Blackwater's versions of events right down to the letter. Now, and it was presented as the State Department's first blush analysis of what had happened there. The interesting thing about this document is that it was in fact written by a Blackwater contractor named Darren Hanner and was placed on State Department stationery and presented in the media as the State Department's version of events. Now, the top law enforcement agency in the United States is the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI was not dispatched by the Bush administration for 2 full weeks after the killings took place. It's criminology 101. You seal off a crime scene, you gather the evidence, you interview witnesses, you try to piece together a timeline of what happened. For 2 weeks, the Bush administration stalled on sending the FBI over there and left the investigation in the hands of the State Department, who was depending on Blackwater to keep it alive while investigating Blackwater. And when the FBI was preparing to go over there, we learned that they were going to be guarded by Blackwater when they went over to investigate Blackwater. And only after Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont raised a ruckus about this did the FBI say, okay, we'll provide our own protection for our agents when they go to investigate Blackwater and not use Blackwater for protection when we investigate Blackwater. But while all of this stuff was going on, something happened that got almost no attention whatsoever. And that was that there was a third force here, not the State Department, not the Iraqi government, and not Blackwater's versions of events, but a third force that responded to that shooting and arrived there about 20 minutes after the last shots were fired. And this force could not be so easily dismissed by Blackwater and its allies as a hotbed of sectarianism because it was in fact the United States military. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Tarsa and his men responded to this shooting. They arrived on the scene. They did a crime scene investigation. They examined shell casings and determined that there was no involvement of Iraqi police or military, and that the shooting, they labeled the shooting a criminal event. Those are the exact words of Lieutenant Colonel Mike Tarsa, that it was unprovoked and that it was in fact a criminal event. And his men said it had every indication of an excessive shooting, and they also said that they were shocked at the caliber of weapon being used by the Blackwater men in the square that day, saying that they were inconsistent with weapons the U.S. military would use when going into a crowded neighborhood. And yet that story went nowhere. No one picked up on it. It still is never talked about when this reporting happens. When the FBI finally did go over to Iraq to investigate, the initial findings were leaked by federal agents who said that their calculation was that 14 of the 17 Iraqis killed that day were killed as a result of unjustified and unprovoked gunfire. Now, mind you, this is the top law enforcement agency of the most tainted and corrupted Justice Department in the history of this country, and they went over and said 14 of the 17 Iraqis killed by forces in the employ of a politically connected company were killed as a result of unjustified and unprovoked gunfire. A military official, U.S. military official, responded to that by saying that the FBI is being too generous to Blackwater, and reiterating its belief that all of the deaths that occurred there were unjustifiable and unprovoked. And then what happened is that Eric Prince, the owner of Blackwater, is called by Henry Waxman, who's the chair of the top investigative body of the Congress, the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. Waxman had been investigating Blackwater for about 3 years leading up to this on all sorts of issues, and had really been aggressive. And the last time he had asked Eric Prince to testify was in February of 2007, and I was there, and instead of coming in person, Eric Prince sent his lawyer to the committee instead of appearing himself. But he had to show up on this day. And so for the first time, this infamous mercenary force in Iraq had a very public face. And so Eric Prince, the Tom Cruise Navy SEAL with the shaved head with the little Superman twirl in the front, comes in wearing his sharp blue suit, much more CEO or businessman than mercenary or Navy SEAL, and he comes in not surrounded by an army of Blackwater bodyguards, but by an army of advisors and PR people and lawyers, and he walks in and he's surrounded by a mob of paparazzi. And I had gone down, and he said that his first thought when he walked into the room that day was, my God, my days as a covert operator are over. That was what was on his mind that day. So I had gone down to D.C. for this, and the night before this hearing, I managed to get a copy of Eric Prince's prepared testimony. He clearly believed that what was going to happen that day, according to this testimony, was that he was going to be asked aggressive questions about what happened at Nisour Square.